So this morning we are going to be in John chapter 11. John chapter 11, if you want to take a Bible and turn with us there, I hope you would. If you're using one of the black hardcover Bibles that's on the chairs, that is page 897, I believe. I wrote it on my hand, but it morphed into something else. So I'm not sure if that's 897 or 867 or 840. It's something. It's in 800s and it's got a 7 in it. So if y'all just want to search, it may be better just look for John chapter 11. John chapter 11. A very familiar passage, I am sure, for many of us in this room. Many of us in this room, especially when we come and we understand the talk of funerals. Charles Spurgeon wrote and preached on this in 1872, and this is how he opened his sermon in 1872. I won't assume many of you were alive then, but his introduction to his sermon in 1872, this is what he said. Death is a terrible picture of our natural state, but is by no means an exaggerated one. The whole world lies before us as a valley of dry bones according to Ezekiel's vision. And if ever the dry bones are to live, it will not be through an energy innate within themselves, nor through a power resident in the most zealous of men, nor through any might which even a prophet could exert apart from God. Education cannot develop life out of death. Persuasion cannot excite it there. Reasoning cannot infuse it. The divine arm must be revealed, or the case is past hope. Jesus must come to the tomb of Lazarus, and his voice must cry, Lazarus, come forth, or else the corpse shall remain inanimate and increase in putrefaction. All that can be done by mortal man may be done, but nothing will be effected unless Jesus, who is the resurrection and the life, shall speak the quickening word. In his omnipotent voice lies the power, but only there. Now let this be taken as a plain statement of our belief as to the Lord's work in salvation, and taken without any mitigation or dilution. We believe that in every case, notice this, we believe in every case, salvation is of the Lord, and of the Lord alone and all together. We come this morning to John chapter 11, beginning in verse 1, and it says, Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was of Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, The illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, so when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you. Are you going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. After saying these things, he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he meant taking rest and sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died. And for your sake, I am glad that I was not there so that you might believe. But let us go to him. So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us go also, that we might die with him. Now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary remained seated in the house. And Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, Your brother will rise again. And Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection of the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. Everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? And she said to him, Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, The teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were there with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where she was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, Where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews said, See how he loved him. But some of them said, Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? And then Jesus, deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave, a stone laid against it, and Jesus said, Take away the stone. Martha and the sister of the dead man said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead for 4 days. And then Jesus said to her, Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on the account of the people standing around me, that they may believe that you sent me. When he said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the man who had died came out, and his hands and his feet were bound up with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, Unbind him and let him go. So as we look at the opening of this passage, we can immediately identify what's happening in verses 1 through verses 4. We see a family. This immediately identified family as the one whom Jesus has spent a great deal of time with. Right? This is no stranger here. Jesus has spent time in the home of Mary and Martha, and we have seen throughout the gospel accounts here. But we come to this account here in John. The story is quite different. It's quite different. This is urgency in this situation. The sisters send to Jesus, and their words are very direct. Lord, he whom you love is ill. There's no greater explanations besides this. Notice that this is not their last resort. They haven't been going about their own concoctions trying to solve the problem, but it says that Lazarus was ill and they turned to Jesus. He is not the last one they think of, but rather out of love and the absolute knowledge of love for each other, they turn to Jesus and they reach out to Jesus for help. And there's no doubting in their hearts of Mary and Martha that Jesus could help their brother Lazarus. However, the great response of Jesus is not about the sickness of Lazarus, for that is not the focus here. Let's look back at verses 1 through 4. There was a certain man ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village. But the sisters sent to him saying, He's the one who you love is ill. But look at verse 4. Verse 4, it says, when Jesus heard it, he says, the illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. And we see here that it's not about the illness. Right here in these opening verses, Jesus begins this whole different storyline that starts developing here. He's about teaching his followers. He's going to be teaching Mary and Martha and those in Judea, as well as all of us here. This is one of the most massive transitional moments in the whole Gospel of John, because this is about leading to his death. This is going to begin leading to his death. This is no small moment, but rather perhaps the most important lesson to be taught during his 3 years of ministry. For even as you and I gather here over 2,000 years later, we have the privilege of not just coming and looking at it on a microcosm moment, but we get to zoom out and we get to hover above the storyline and we get to see what's happening here. And we get to look at it from a wholly different perspective into the situation, and we get to be taught as well. We get to look at this and to be taught. So here in the beginning, before we even get into this next session, beginning in verse 5, we get to begin to look with great anticipation of what God is going to do. Why now? What is the point of this? Why would, in this moment, knowing full well that God can do as He pleases, God could have been off teaching, the word comes that Lazarus is ill, and I mean, we know that when the centurion says, my son is ill, and Jesus speaks and his son is healed, Jesus could have just said, the word could have come that Lazarus is ill. Jesus says, okay, he's healed, move on. He didn't have to go back to Bethany to heal Lazarus. He didn't have to be a part of that. At any moment, God could have done what He would have chosen to do, but there's something else going on in this picture. There's something else developing. God is going to change the course of history by the time this story is done, and He's going to completely show Himself in a way that no one would expect. And we get to know that because we have this outside perspective on what's going on. And so as we come to verse 5, we see, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when He heard that Lazarus was ill, look at verse 6 here. He stayed 2 days longer in the place that he was. Then after this, He said to His disciples, let us go to Judea again. And the disciples said to Him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you. Are you going to go there again? And Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble. Remember, this is going back to what we saw in John 8 and John 9, when He says, we must be about the business of my Father while it is still day, while it is still light. Why? Because night is coming. He's telling us we've got to be about the business of the Father. The illustration of light here, I am the light of the world, this is not new language. Remember, He's building on what He's already been saying here. So in verse 10 He says, but if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. And so in verse 11 He says, after saying these things, He says to them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. And the disciples said, Lord, if he's just asleep, he's going to recover. And so Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought He just meant he was taking rest and sleep. And then verse 14, Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad I was not there so that you may believe. But let us go to him. And so Thomas, called the twin, said to his disciples, let us go that we may die with you. So verses 5 through 16, this is crammed full of information for all of us in this room, because at some point, either we've lost someone that we care deeply about, or we're going to lose someone we care deeply about. So this speaks to all of us at some level. So when we look at verse 5, we see that verse 5 and 6, He loves Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. But in His love, in verse 6, it says He stays 2 days longer in the place where He loves. John verifies the love. He verifies what's going on here. Now the tension builds as we see Lazarus is greatly ill from the disease, and we don't know what the disease is. And it does no good to speculate what the disease is. And here we see in these opening verses that John gives us confirmation of the great affection towards Lazarus, as well as the response to the message that Jesus receives, which is to stay 2 days longer. 2 days longer. If we were to read this verse by verse and not jump ahead and read before, most of us are going crazy, right? It's almost as if when you pray to God and you want your prayer to be answered immediately, and then all of a sudden you're like, God's not answering my prayer. Maybe we have a bad connection. The whole "can you hear me now?" And obviously you're not hearing me now. You know, it's in that moment where perhaps you're in the hospital and the doctor says you need to call the family, and you start calling the family in, and somebody says, well, I'm busy right now, I'll come later next month. And you're like, no, that's not the situation here. We need to be here now. But notice this, He's waiting 2 more days before doing anything, just as he heard his beloved friend is ill. This is not how you and I would want this to go down. We wouldn't want Jesus to respond when we're in grave danger, or when one of our friends is gravely ill, or one of our family members. When we pray, we want the response before we even end the prayer, right? We want the lightning bolt moment to happen. We want God to just, boom, we finish the prayer before we say amen. It's like, we want it to happen. The I Dream of Jeannie moment, we want it to be right there. We want it done. You know what I'm saying? We don't want to have to wait. When we pray, we want the response to be there. When we are suffering, we desire the relief before the suffering has even begun. We don't want to suffer. It's hard for us to fully grasp the words of James when he says we should count trials and suffering as all of joy, that we are being brought to completeness so that we may be found lacking nothing. That's what he says in James 4. How many of you have that on your bumper sticker on the back of your car? You know what I'm saying? Anybody have James 1:4 on the back of your car? Because I'm going to hire you to work at Bookcliff if you do. We have a job for you. Anybody who's ever been in ministry, when you sign up for ministry, you pretty much say, hey, God, we'll take it. And if you ever lived life and you say, I'm going to follow Jesus, you pretty much say, what James is saying here is that you're going to carry that and you're going to walk into the fire and say, it's good. But this is what it's saying, like we have to be willing to do this. We remember that we have a different perspective on this story, though. Lazarus' sickness will not bring death, right? But it's going to bring about the greater glory of Christ. So when we look at this second section, we realize that Jesus waits 2 more days, and we see that it's not about showing disregard, but it's about showing overwhelming love for Mary, Martha, and for Lazarus. Or it's not even about showing a greater love. It's not even about him being distracted by where he currently is serving, but rather about Jesus desiring to show Mary and Martha and Lazarus the greatest love of all. Think about this. It's not about distraction. It's not about, what I'm doing right now, how I'm teaching these people is more important. It's not about, maybe I can show them just a little bit of love if I wait 2 more days. It's not about, maybe they'll get the fullness of the illustration if I wait 2 more days. It's not about even just a minute, a bit of love. It's about showing them the greatest amount of love possible. He's desiring to show them the greatest love of all, himself and himself glorified. There's a new sign that I have to pass every day when I come to work and when I go home. And the new sign says, Jesus loves you. And that's good and all. There's no bad theology in that. But as I was driving home yesterday, I was looking at that sign again. I was like, that's good. It's encouraging. It's been one of those weeks I was sitting there thinking, that's good, but it's not best. Think about that for a moment. Jesus loves you. There's nothing wrong with the statement. If you have that on your bumper sticker, that's fine. I'm not telling you to rip it off. Don't take the paint off your car for this one. But think about that for a moment. Jesus loves you. Fine. Jesus is love. That's best. Okay? What's happening here in this moment is waiting 2 days. He's desiring to show them the glory of God. We see that in verse 4 of John chapter 11. He who is ill, Jesus hears this. The illness does not lead to death. Why? Because all who love Jesus, death is not the end. It's only the beginning. It's not the end. It's not the end. So he says this in verse 4, it is for the glory of God so that the Son of God might be glorified through it. Now there's so much here that we could spend the rest of the day unpacking, but I'm trying to go 44 verses into this, which we probably won't get to, but we're going to try. But we see right here in verse 4 that he says, so that the Son of God might be glorified. What does the glorification of the Son of God mean? It means that we understand the definition of love, and the definition of love is not that Jesus is love, or Jesus loves you, but that Jesus is love. When we understand Jesus and the personification of who Jesus is, it redefines how we understand love. As we don't say that he loves us, but we understand that he is love, and that we redefine love based on who Jesus is. Does it make sense? Is that we go back and we don't say that he loves us, but that he is love, and we understand that he is love, that we redefine everything else, and everything else that's happening in our life is based on who Jesus is and what he has done for us and how he has made himself known to us. It changes everything. It changes our perspective on everything. It changes how we do life. It changes how we look at life. It changes everything. Because when we understand that he is love, then how we react to and respond to things in this world and how we react and respond to illness and pain and suffering, we understand that he is love. And even in this illness and suffering and pain and death, it is love. It is grace. Here, Jesus knew that the time on earth was coming to an end and the moment would be the last great sign. Now think about this. Follow me with this. This would be the last great sign. This would be for many, the last great moments of him being seen around him, and for those that he cared so dearly for, that death was not the conqueror. He was going to display that death was not the conqueror, death was not the end, but rather death would be conquered. Death would be conquered. Death was not the ultimate. Death was not the king. Death was not the conqueror, but death would be conquered, and that he had power over death. Again, we look at this with a different perspective, but think about this, friends. Would you not want to know that your friend, the friend that you had been hanging out with, the friend whom you had a relationship with, I mean, we look at the verses 1 through 4 here and know that whom they dearly loved, they had a relationship with, they hung out with, they had as a guest in their house. Would you rather not know whom your friend was? If your brother died and your friend came back to town, would you rather not know that he had the power to heal him or he had the power to bring somebody back from the dead? Which power would you rather your friend have? Especially knowing that in just a few weeks, he would be carrying his own cross and be being nailed to his own cross. Which part of your friend would you rather know? He is demonstrating his love. Think about this. He's demonstrating this a few weeks before he would be nailed to the cross himself. Just as God provided a substitute for Abraham at the altar where Isaac was to be sacrificed, we see even here Jesus was placing himself in the place of Lazarus and in the place for you and in the place for me, and he was demonstrating his power to us in this moment. We should not take lightly the words of Jesus here. Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him, to bring him back into this body of this dead man. Is as difficult as it is for you and I to awaken someone who is sleeping. Christ is all powerful. And now the time has come for Jesus to return to Bethany to attend to Lazarus and those close to him. But now the disciples at this point are more worried about Jesus' safety. We see this from verses 5 to 16. They're more concerned about his safety than the life of Lazarus. But this is because the last time that Jesus was in Judea, around Jerusalem, which is quite close to Bethany, they tried to stone him. Remember, he comes out of the temple, he talks about I'm the light of the world, and they try to stone him. He heals the blind man, and they decide to kick the blind man out of the temple. Desynagoguing was what we said last time. And so he's been causing a ruckus all about this, so they've been trying to stone him. The disciples did not want to be part of the party. They did not want to witness the stoning of Jesus. And so they questioned him about going back and about the best ways and means. Do we go back under the cover of darkness? Do we try to sneak in and go take care of business here? And what Jesus rebukes them and he teaches them a whole nother lesson is there's no need to try to sneak in and do the right thing. There's no need to try to do this. Why? Because there's 12 hours in the day. And we shall travel by days so that we do not get lost or stumble by night. Why? Because we are safe, for the sovereignty of God cannot be thwarted by the deeds of man. We will go back, is what Jesus says. We're not going to hide our going back. We have nothing to fear. But Jesus says, we shall return. Now, I know we have a lot to cover here, and I know we need to move on, but we can't pass up the boldness of Thomas here, where he rallies the troops and he says to the disciples, let's also go that we might die with him. Right? That's the boldness of the twin here named Thomas. And he's decided that if Jesus is going to go and die in Bethany, so be it for the rest of them to go and to die with him. Right? Usually it only takes one person to rally the troops and a rallying cry for the home. Thomas recognized the danger, but he did not heed the message of Jesus, and Jesus was in complete control of the situation. George Whitefield put it like this: if our dear Master will go to Judea and hazard his precious life, let us no longer make any frivolous excuses, but let us manfully accompany him. And if the Jews should not be permitted to stone, but also to kill him, let us also go and die with him. We cannot die in a better cause. This is a speech worthy of a Christian hero. And Thomas herein has set the example that we should follow his steps by exciting and provoking one another closely to adhere to the message of Jesus, especially when the cause and the interest is in immediate danger. This is an exhortation, it seems, had a proper effect because they all went back knowing that they faced stoning. And they accompanied Jesus along the way. Catch this. Ever since Jesus stood in front of the candelabras saying, I am the light of the world, and then he walked out because they picked up stones, and he healed the blind beggar at the steps of the temple and caused the ruckus about, is this really the blind guy or not? The Jews have been on this mantra of finding ways to try to pick at Jesus. And now they're concerned about their lives and their safety. And here Whitefield points us forward saying, is there ever a mission more worthy than the mission of the gospel going forth? Because here, if Jesus says, it is for the glory of the King that Lazarus is ill, does this not point us forward and give us to what Revelation 6 foreshadows when he opens the fifth seal? In Revelation 6 verse 9 it says, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness that they had borne. There is no promise. There is no promise that lives will not be lost. In verse 10, they cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? And they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the total number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were killed as they themselves had been. There's a message there. We don't need to go about wandering in the darkness, for the sovereign God directs our ways. Verse 17. Jesus arrives at Bethany after 4 days after the burial of Lazarus, as the tradition of mourning was still going on at the home of Mary and Martha. But we see here that when Martha hears about the arrival of Jesus, she goes out to meet him 2 miles outside of the town. It says to him, beginning in verse 21, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Get this. Martha understood when she first sent the message to Jesus that Jesus could heal Lazarus. She had no doubt in his ability to heal the one she loved. How often does the brokenness of our desperately wicked hearts rise against Christ? Friends, let's grasp this moment when we are under some type of affliction. Friends, when we have all cried out to God at some point when we are under pressure, the strain, pain, stress, suffering. Our friends, our family are suffering. Why did God not keep off this sickness? Why has God not healed? Why did God not prevent this from happening? Why has God not protected my family? Knowing that He has the power to do this, we've asked these questions in some way, shape, or form. Why has God not fill in the blank? If you haven't asked those questions, you're better than I am. Friends, we perhaps should pray and labor to be delivered from this brokenness in our hearts because we have it, and we should long for the time when death would be swallowed up of life, and we should never, ever again feel this way, because this is what we're looking forward to in Revelations. And we should pray and we should long for against good and gracious, and we should desire the Redeemer's face to be in front of us. And here, this is what Martha is saying when she goes further. She says, even now, whatever you ask from God, God will give you. There's a concern here that Jesus did not arrive earlier, and then there's also a request. Just do something. Just do something. To which Jesus responded, your brother will rise again. Now we remember, Martha's a believer. She trusts Jesus. So we can almost, if we're watching this play out on a movie scene, we're watching this in the theater, we can almost see Martha getting put out here in the moment. Like we can see her face perhaps turning red. I know he's going to rise again in the last day. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking you to do something. Her desire was not to lose her brother in the first place. Now she wants Jesus to act, to fix the hurt, to fix the separation that she's feeling. Her desire was to be with her brother now. She's not looking ahead to the kingdom right now, for she has some sort of grasp of that, but she wants him to look right now at the immediate. She sent for Jesus, and he arrives 4 days late. Have you ever been in a moment in your life where you felt like God was late? Like the comfort and the joy, yeah, it's good, but it's late. If only you had done this. And that's what she's saying here. You're late. It's the most common conversation I have as a pastor. You know, we talk about it on almost a monthly basis here at Bookcliff, and it's like the parenting conversation. And that's the best illustration because I'm a parent of 3 children at all different stages of life. So this is, Whitney knew this was going to come up this week, which is why it's funny. We got a swimming pool, like one of those portable swimming pool things in our house this week. So this is completely off, but not really. So, you know, when you're a parent, your kids want to do things, you know that's just not a good idea. But at some point, you're just going to give in because it's going to be fun. You know what I'm saying? So we got this portable swimming pool because they go on sale every so often, and you usually buy them off-season or pre-season or whatever to take advantage of the sale. Well, last year we had one of those inflatable pools. Well, when you live in the desert, you have wind. I've never lived in a place that has wind like this. And so the problem last season was the wind would come along and all of a sudden you've watered your lawn much more than you expected to. You know what I'm saying? So this year I decided I was going to get one that wasn't inflatable, that actually had a frame. Well, the thing shows up and Bruce comes over for dinner on Friday afternoon. And when Bruce comes over for dinner, I usually have a work project. So that's why he's invited over for dinner. So I ended up getting this thing out of the box. And the Joker's 5 feet tall. Like, I'm not exaggerating. Like, it's up to, like, it's legitimately, like, right here on me. And so we built it. And before we get into the drought where they turn off all the water, I started filling it up. Well, we finished filling it up yesterday. And, well, the kids, you know, kids in water, they were dying to get in. And so we're like, it's going to be free. Like, we filled it up now so to have the rest of the month to warm up. And they were dying to get in. And so I was here working on some different things yesterday. And they're just dying. And so Whitney finally caves in and lets them get in. And you see them, they're like, it's cold. Or like, of course it's cold. One, it's like barely above 70-something degrees outside, and you just put all this cold water in the pool. But it's like that when we look at God, like he's looking down at us, and he's saying, I know what's best, and we keep arguing, you're late, you're late, you're late. Well, no, I actually am right on time. You're just being that kid who's being persistent, and finally God's just like, well, here you go, have it. But we think about that, and that's in the most common conversations that we have in the office. It's those types of things where we say, God is not in control. God doesn't know what he's doing. And we're like, but we're the kids, and in reality, we're looking at things with such a perspective of this is where time begins for us, and this is where time ends for us. And follow with me on this. I know you think this is such simplistic, and it is, but it's not at the same time. But this is where time begins. This is our birth date, and this is the day of our death. And if you didn't know, we're all going to die, so we're all going to have one of these. Sorry if that's a new thing to you, but it's coming. But we're all living between this part of our timeline. And when God looks down, and if you've been here for more than 3 months, you've heard this a few dozen times, and he sees that Eternity past is forever along that way, and eternity future is forever along that way. And God's not waiting for tomorrow to happen. You know what I'm saying? God doesn't have to wait for tomorrow to see what tomorrow is going to bring. He doesn't have to wait for 2019 and 2020 and 2025 to roll around to see what's going to happen in 2025 and the year 3000 and however many more years are going to. He doesn't have to wait for those things to roll around on the calendar to see what's going to happen. Like he looks down and he sees what happened on Genesis day 1, however long Genesis day 1 was, and he can see what's going to happen on the last day, and he knows it all. Just as much as I knew that when the kids, if they were going to get in the pool yesterday, it was going to get cold and they weren't going to stay in there long enough for them to even, like, it wasn't even going to be worth it. It was going to be worth it for us because we were going to laugh. I have a video. If I was going to be really humiliating my kids, I'd show you the video. It's quite funny. But we laugh, and because most all of you have had kids before, and you can sit there and say, hey, we saw that one coming. Because we have the perspective of looking down. And God has the perspective of looking down. And we sit here and we look at this story, and we step away from this for just a moment, and we say, and we've all said it at some point, God was late. God has been late. God's not acting on our schedule, whatever that schedule is. And even with the life of Mary and Martha here, I mean, let's just be honest. She's acting the same way you and I act. She's acting the same way you and I act when somebody in our family is sick, when we're sick, when we're dealing with stress and pain and suffering. Her response was, I want you right now. Look at her words. It doesn't take a Greek translation to understand what she's saying here. She says, I know that he's going to rise again on the last day. I'm not looking for the last day. I'm looking for today. Can we deal with today? My problem is not with the last day. My problem was with the feelings of separation I'm having today. But look at Jesus' words in verse 25. He says, I am. The most ultimate of the I am statements are found here, right here. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. Everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. The greater necessity here is not that Lazarus be healed from his disease. Catch that. It's not that he be healed, but that Lazarus have life. The greatest need here was not that Lazarus experienced that pain, but that Jesus showed the greatest amount of love possible. Remember, the whole derailed earlier about love. It's important that we understand that Jesus showed us the greatest amount of love possible, and understand that we understand the definition of love is not based on a human definition, but on a Jesus definition, that Jesus doesn't love us, but that Jesus is love, and we understand that Jesus is love. It redefines how we do love. And we see that here because the greatest need is not that Lazarus not experience pain. It's not about the amount of pain that he experienced or that he dies, but about that Jesus shows and demonstrates and lives and is love. The final I am statement for the time of Jesus' life is coming quickly to an end, is to show that I am the resurrection and the life. This is the last sign that Jesus would perform, because here, right after this moment, the Jews are going to quickly begin to work to have Jesus arrested, to have Jesus tried, and to have him sent off and put to death. This is their end goal here. But first, before any of that happens, the ultimate goal here, the aim here, is that the followers not may, but must believe. Her confession, Martha's confession here, is the same as that of Peter's confession of Christ in Matthew 16, verses 13 to 20. When Jesus asked Peter, who do they say that I am? And Peter responds, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. The recognition of the Savior as the Son of God. And so in verse 28 through verse 37, we come to this next big chunk of this next big section here. And so we see after their conversation, Martha returns to the house. Because we notice here, Mary has yet to come out here. So either Mary's more bitter, or she's dealing with the mourners, or whatever's going on here, but she hasn't come out. So Martha returns to the house to get Mary, while Jesus stays on the outskirts of town here waiting. And so Mary rushes out. She rushes out of the house causing a bit of commotion in the house, and the mourners and the family and otherwise thinking that she is running to the tomb to mourn, know it's their duty to go mourn with her, but instead of going to the tomb, she goes down to the road. And what happens when she goes down to the road? They were surprised to find Jesus and the disciples, they're gathered there. And we notice here that immediately she falls at the feet. She falls at the feet of Jesus as if she's come to royalty or perhaps a great religious teacher or rabbi. Mary shows great respect and honor here and admiration for Jesus as she sees him. And then through the tears, she turns up to him and says the same thing that Martha said, Lord, if you had been here, notice this in verse 32. Verse 32, read this in your Bible so you believe me. I don't want you just to believe me, I want you to believe the word. It says here in verse 32 of chapter 11, when Mary gets there, she came to where Jesus was and saw him, fell at his feet, saying to him, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. This time, there's not a long and drawn out discourse between Jesus and Mary, but Jesus sees the weeping of Mary and also the mourners. Remember, they bring in professional mourners here. This is like a second parade here going on in New Orleans. And John phrased it that he was both moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And Jesus was moved for he had love for Mary, and he had love for Martha, and he had love for Lazarus. And to see someone you love in pain brings you pain. Jesus was, get this, we've been talking about this for the last several weeks. Remember, the call to salvation is not a blanket call. He's not just saying, everybody in Booklet's going to get saved today, but he knows people and he calls them by name. He knows them as people. He knows them individually. He's working in their hearts. And so we see this specifically. Jesus was human and he was God. And there's a great display of his humanity here in verse 35 where it clearly states that Jesus wept. But we cannot just leave out the clarity of the other statements also included here where Jesus was deeply moved. And in verse 33 and again in verse 38, the continual questioning of his motives. Where were you? Where were you, the mourners were asking? Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Where were you? And here we have a fundamental lack of faith and a lack of understanding, or perhaps better put, a fundamental lack of perspective in what is going on. Everyone thought they had a better plan. Think about this when you gather around your Thanksgiving table or around your Christmas table. Everybody thinks they have a better plan. If only Jesus had fit into their plans and the way they thought it should have gone. If he could have gotten there in their time frame, healed Lazarus, whether present or from afar. Either way, they had pleaded with him, let him know that he was loved and he was ill, and there seemed to be no response as he carried on from where he was for 2 more days. And then he began, from what we can tell, a 2-day journey back, only to arrive 4 days. Notice this, he arrives 4 days after the burial. Did he actually love Lazarus? That had to be the thought going on around the crowd. That had to be the thought process. When we lose some other part of our life that is important for our safety, our comfort, and joy, the first thing that happens is we feel that we have lost control of our lives. Think about this. When you lose your job, when you lose something that's part of your security, something that makes you feel comfortable, that makes you feel like you have control of this thing, we feel like we're losing complete control. We feel like we've lost something that's anchoring us down, right? When our marriages are in shambles, or when our relationships with our in-laws or outlaws or whomever they are, when our church is not functioning the way we want it to be, when our social circles aren't functioning the way that we want it to be, we get mad, right? Because we feel helpless and we feel like our control circles aren't the way they should be. And so, friends, this isn't true because just because we say or we feel like I was in control of my life and now it's been taken away from me, just because we get angry, it doesn't make that true. Because God's grace will eventually, hopefully sooner than later, make our sight and our vision become clear. And this is where we see it's not until we lose control of our lives. Get this, it's not until we lose control of our lives that we begin to understand that we never had control in the first place. It's not until we lose control that we understand that we never had control in the first place. It's not until we lose control of our prosperity and our health that we realize that we never were even really in control. It's harder for us, and I don't want to generalize or overgeneralize this, but when we live in a Western culture, especially in a country like ours where everything is based on a democracy where we vote and we have our say, or a republic where we vote and we have our say and we demand and we get, it's harder for us to grasp this because we're told and we're taught and we understand that we are ultimately the controllers of our own life. If you raise or are born and raised in an Eastern culture where there are kings and powers who tell you how you're going to do things, who control your finances, who control your culture and all, this concept's not so hard to understand because you're born never having control. You're born told how many children you're going to have. You're born telling you where you're going to live and what you're going to do for a living. It's pushed on you from day one. The concept of a sovereign God and a sovereign king, well, sure, because they're born under a sovereign ruler. But here for us, it's harder for us to grasp this, the fact that we aren't actually in control of our own bodies. The point is, I'm not trying to get us to debate political or ruling systems. I'm just trying to get us to understand that it's harder for us to grasp it, but at some point, I hope we can grasp that we aren't in control, that there is a sovereign ruler. The point is that sickness comes into the lives of people. Suffering comes, and when it does come, it will not leave us as we are. We're not left the same when suffering enters our lives. When pain comes, when we lose someone we dearly love, if we're facing death, it changes us. It changes who we are. It changes our identity. It changes our character. It changes how we function. It can either let us and drive us to the one who is sovereign, to the King. And we see Mary and Martha running to the feet of Jesus, and they know that Jesus knows us and he understands us. And even when the answers are not the ones that we like, and even when we don't have control, even when we come to the place that we realize that we are not sovereign in our lives, and it drives us to know the sovereign King. And in this moment, we can look back and we can step back and we can know him and we can love him more and we can worship him better and we can see him more clearly. And we can say, in that moment where we're suffering and pain comes, we can step back and say, it's okay because I know the sovereign and I can worship better. Or else we can come back and be bitter and angry and frustrated and say, this life is just falling apart. This morning we look at this story and we can glean from it the fact that he cares for us, he loves us, he desires us to be with him. He desires us to be his children, and he cares for us, and our lives are meant for his glory. And get this, our lives are meant for his glory, and he will be glorified. He will be glorified. Verse 38. Maybe we'll make it this morning. I'm going to read this section for us again this morning. Verse 38. Notice this. Then Jesus, deeply moved again. Notice the writer puts in there, and it's even in the translation, again, came to the tomb, and it was a cave, and a stone lay against it, and Jesus said, take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor. He's going to be ripe, for he has been dead for 4 days. And Jesus said to her, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. When he said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The man who died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips and his face wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. Key words here in verse 38. He was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Jesus, deeply moved. The Greek words here are the words that generally mean angry. I like this kind of God. I'm okay with an angry God. I think God should have been angry a lot more in the Bible. His people were dumb. Y'all know what I'm saying? Maybe not. Maybe y'all don't like an angry God, but I do. He was angry. In fact, one of the words literally means to bellow like an animal. to roar like an animal. I mean, can you picture this for a moment? I mean, I have 3 kids, so you can see in my mind I'm thinking roar like a lion, because there's a song, roar like a lion. You know, my kids are singing it. Okay, y'all aren't with me right now. Y'all need to, this is fun. It says that he came to the tomb angry, furious. B.B. Warfield, an older theologian who was at Princeton in the late 1800s and early 1900s, wrote this about the text. He said, Jesus advanced to the tomb not weak. He wasn't weak and sniveling or crying, but he was as a champion preparing for conflict. John uncovers the heart of Jesus as he wins. Get this. Jesus goes to the tomb, as B.B. Warfield puts it, to win our salvation. Not in cold unconcern, but with fiery anger. Catch this is going to be good. Fiery anger against our enemy. Bring it on. Like, that's my God. Like, yes. Like, this is going to be a cage fight between Jesus and the enemy. Like, yes. Okay, y'all aren't there yet, but we're, like, think about this. Jesus is going to unleash his wrath against the enemy. Like, that's good stuff. Y'all just haven't had the week I had. But what's interesting is he's angry, and he's not, notice what he's not angry at. He's not angry at the family. He doesn't go off on Mary and Martha. He doesn't go off at the professional mourners. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of an introvert. When people start wailing for the sake of wailing, like, y'all need to back up off. Like, that's not me. But he doesn't get angry at them. He's not like one of Job's friends. He doesn't just show up and say, well, I don't know why he died so young. It was just a tragedy. He doesn't do that. He's not like that. And he doesn't just say, well, I have the power to raise this man from the dead. He doesn't just say that. He says, I am the source of life. I am the power that gives life to everything. And look at this. He claims to be God. And he's not just mad at himself because he missed the boat here. He showed up too late. Here's suffering and here's evil. And he's not mad at himself because he missed it, because this is happening, because he could have controlled this somehow. No, that's not what's happening here. And he's acting as if the human race doesn't deserve the world. He's not acting that way. He's saying, well, y'all deserve this. You turned from God in Genesis 2 and 3. You deserve what you're getting here. What we see here is what's completely unfolding because of what happens in Genesis 3 and what Romans 8 tells us. The world doesn't work. It doesn't work. Suffering and evil, death and disease, all these things that were not originally a part of God's design are now here. So Jesus is not mad at Mary and Martha and the mourners. He's not mad at that. He's not mad at himself. He's not mad at God or acting out as if this world isn't what the human race deserves. Notice this. He's mad at death. He's mad at death. He doesn't come into this picture stoic, passive. He doesn't come and say, well, this is inevitable. This is what's going to happen. He doesn't just do what I did. All of us in the room are going to die. It's just what's going to happen. Here's the problem. True evil, suffering and death is the death sentence of the human race. This is what we're all going to experience. The reality is how can he destroy death without destroying all of us? It's what we deserve. It's the curse we live under. The answer is this miracle shows not only that he came to fight for us, but also that he came to die for us. This is the turning point, like we talked about in the very beginning. This is the turning point of the book of John. This is the climactic miracle of all the miraculous signs. This is the 7th one. John 1 through 11 is all about Jesus' life, but starting here in John chapter 12 is all about Jesus' death. As we go into John 12 next week, this is the turning point. This is the hinge point. This is the linchpin where everything's going to turn. Jesus tells Martha, take away the stone, which had to be a hard command, realizing that you've been mourning the death of your brother for 4 days, and her response is incredible. But Jesus says, she says, it's going to stink. This is going to be vile. There's going to be an odor here. If we think about it today, we may keep people out of the ground for quite some time, preparing for family members to come back for the funerals, preparing for people to come back for the wakes, and we think 4 days is not that long. But here, they look back and say, he's going to stink. They didn't have the preservation methods that we have. They didn't have the embalming techniques and all the things that we do to keep the bodies together. And Jesus rebukes her in verse 40. He says, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see? Notice this. It's not about Lazarus here. This is about him. Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God in verse 40? The whole point of all this occurred in the last week of the life of Lazarus is that they would see and experience the glory of God. And Jesus prays, and then he commands with a loud voice. He commands with a loud voice for Lazarus to come out. Then Lazarus, bound with the burial cloth, comes walking out of the tomb, and Jesus says to them, unbind him. This last great I am statement, the last great sign, as John puts it in his gospel before Jesus would be arrested, tried, and crucified. The perspective makes all the difference. Jesus shows Mary, Martha, and now he shows Lazarus. He shows Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, the disciples, and all those gathered, the greatest amount of love possible by demonstrating the resurrection firsthand, by showing them the glory of God and all its greatness so that they would believe. So that they would believe, so they could see and understand, even when their faith was waning. He did not withhold himself or the glory he desired to show them, but he gave them all himself. Friends, let us get this picture. Let us understand the fullness of what's happening here. He knows. He knows that if he raises Lazarus, he's burying himself. It's almost as if he sees his friend in the grips of a monster, and he knows he's going to get his friend out of the grips of the monster. He's going to have to throw himself in there. As he strides up to the tomb, there's a voice saying, if you interrupt this funeral, it's going to be your own. And he says, okay, I'm going to do it. Friends, this is how much he loves us. This is the definition of love. Look at how he loves us specifically. Behold how he loves us. Let's get the context of this picture, and we're going to be done here this morning. These events unfold, and like we said, John chapter 12 starts leading to the death of Jesus. The last sign that he would show them is bringing Lazarus out of the dead. Love is God. Love is trusting God, even in the suffering, when it seems like there is silence, when it seems like he is 4 days away, 4 days late. The message of Christ is that there is a message of a greater love and a glory being fostered for you and all those around you. The question is not where or what if, or if only, or whatever other if there could be. The realization is that Christ has the perfect perspective. Christ is not limited by our finite understanding of time and circumstances, but looks down and sees the whole story unfolded before him, and he is conducting the most magnificent symphony that brings the greatest amount of glory to him every time in the perfect amount of time. It is not about our understanding, but about his sovereignty, because get this, he brings forth the resurrection before he's taken to the cross so that his friends and his followers would understand that as he's hanging on the cross, that he does not just die, but he conquers death. As Mary, Martha, and Lazarus are standing at the cross, they can look to Lazarus and say, you were dead, and now you're alive. I know I'm a very practical person, and perhaps he did it for me to remember that Lazarus was dead. He's going to die. We've got this thing, guys. Our team wins. Our team wins. It's not about our understanding, but it's about his sovereignty. It's not about our wills, our wants, our pain, our desire, but about resting and knowing that God always brings glory to himself, and to show the greatest love possible to his children. When we are suffering, the Father is grieved. We see that twice. He is not getting joy out of our pain. We see that in this passage, but we do not give up or give in. We press on for the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is at hand, and the prize is far greater than the moments that try to distract us. Get this. The pain and the suffering we're in that we talk about, that we read about in James chapter 1, can either distract us or they can point us forward. For the disciples that night that Jesus was on the cross, it could either distract them from the glory of the Lord, or they can remember Lazarus right here with Mary and Martha and remember, we win this. We got this. When they're debating, could he not call the angels? Could he not just climb down by himself? And yeah. The point is, he's conquering this thing even while hanging there. As we prepare for John 12, this morning let us stop and remember the greatness of the glory of the King this morning.